Welcome to Specific Lab. Today I'm going to show you how to turn some plywood into an awesome wooden mallet. Let's begin. I've been wanting a wooden mallet for a while now, so I could use it with my chisels and my other wooden products. But instead of going out and buying a new one, I decided to see if I could build one with some birch plywood. Now plywood is definitely not the most preferred material to make a mallet out of, but I thought it would look really unique. I first started by taking the plywood over to my table saw and cut it down to an easier manageable section. I then grabbed my sled and proceeded to cut the plywood into several smaller squares. I was just eyeballing the dimensions, but they came out to be just under 3 inches each. After they were cut to size, I then glued each of them face to face to create a really long cube type structure. I then rotated them to their side, making sure to keep them on the flat surface of my table saw so they would dry as straight as possible. I then clamped them together and then waited a couple days to make sure they were secure. I then used the bandsaw to remove the corner edges, which will make the next step a little easier. Now to make this block of wood circular, I needed to turn it on my lathe. And to do that, I needed to find the center marks on both ends. I first tried to use the spur with the hopes that it would have enough grip, but I quickly found out that the plywood would just spin in its teeth. I did give this a few tries, but to no avail. Obviously trying to hold it together with this end piece here is just stripping the end out of this plywood and really making it useless. So I got this plate here. I'm going to try and adapt it to it using some screws. Hopefully it'll hold it, and then we'll go from there. So I traced out the best locations on the end, drilled some pilot holes, and then attached a spindle with 4 drywall screws. I then returned to the lathe with a much better outcome. Now during the process, I tried a few different speeds and a few different tools. But as the plywood was being rounded, I noticed small chunks of wood starting to fly, which made me a little bit nervous. So I took my tools over to my grinder and gave them a sharper edge. This definitely helped, and I was able to get the block turned into a circular shape. But again, as I continued to turn the plywood, small chunks of wood would periodically eject itself from the piece. After having this plywood start to split and chunks coming out of it, I don't feel that this is the safest thing to be turning. And so I'm gonna stop right here and see what I can make out of this. So at this point, I decided to remove the tailstock, grab some sandpaper, and smooth this down by hand. Once it reached an acceptable feel, I removed the spindle and took it to the bandsaw. At the saw, I tried to follow some of the seams of the plywood to keep the mallet as straight as possible, and the length of the head was just over 4 inches long. I then took the mallet over to the belt sander to help reduce the sharp edges and to put a slight curve on the front and back. I then hand sanded the entire mallet, removing any burrs and continuing to smooth out the edges. Once it was to my liking, I grabbed my rubber mallet for a quick comparison and saw that it was slightly larger, which should work well for me. Now to create the handle, I found an old piece of 1-inch wooden dowel laying around my shop that I believed to be oak, which should work well. So I used a rubber mallet handle as a guide for the length of this handle, and then I trimmed it to length on the miter saw. To create the hole in the mallet head, I wanted to use a 1-inch Forstner bit on my drill press. And to hold the plywood still, I used a few scrap pieces of wood with 45-degree angle cuts. I first started to drill the hole by holding the mallet with my hands, but quickly realized I needed extra gripping power. So I grabbed some cable ties and strapped them around both sides of the head and continued to use a Forstner bit to drill out the hole. I then test fitted the handle in the mallet, which was smooth but a snug fit. So I grabbed the wood glue and added some to the inside of the mallet and to the handle before pushing them together. I then added a couple of nails into the top of the mallet with the hopes that it would slightly spread the wood apart to help it stay in place. Now this step may not be necessary for this setup, but it gave me peace of mind. I then gave the entire mallet a nice coating of boiled linseed oil and set it aside to dry. Now you may choose to use a different type of coating, and that is up to you. But I would avoid any hard finishes like urethane where it could chip off during use. It was now time for a test. So I grabbed one of my chisels and some scrap wood. Now even though my chisel needed to be sharpened, the mallet powered through and easily removed the wood. This design seems to work very well, and I hope it lasts for a long time in my shop. And besides the practical standpoint, I really like how the mallet resembles a beehive. Now if you enjoyed this project, make sure you click the like button and tell us what you think about it in the comments. I also have some other great projects right over here, so make sure you check those out. Otherwise, have fun building.